The sun over the high valley was a brilliant, unforgiving gold, baking the hard-packed earth of the town's main street until it was as pale as bone. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where the only sounds were the lazy buzzing of flies near the water trough and the distant, mournful call of a crow from a nearby pine tree. For a young woman named Phoebe, however, the peace of the day was a cruel contrast to the storm raging in her heart. She stood on the wooden porch of her family's small homestead, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles were white. Her eyes, usually the color of a calm summer sky, were shadowed with a worry that seemed far too heavy for her young shoulders. Inside the simple house, the air was thick with a silence that was louder than any shouting. Her father, a man worn down by years of hard labor and bad luck, stared into the cold fireplace. Her mother, Lydia, moved a damp cloth over the same spot on the kitchen table again and again, her movements slow with a deep, helpless sadness. The source of their despair was a piece of paper that lay on that very table, a promissory note signed by her father, a debt that had grown and festered like a sickness until it threatened to consume them all. The man who held that debt was named Jasper. He was a man whose wealth was matched only by the hardness of his heart. He owned the largest spread of land in the valley and the bank that had lent Phoebe's family the money they needed to survive a harsh winter. Jasper was not a patient man, and he had decided on his own method of payment. He wanted Phoebe. He did not speak of love or affection, for he felt neither. He saw her beauty and her gentle spirit as a prize to be won, another possession to add to his collection. He had come to the house the week before, his boots kicking up dust, and laid out his terms. Phoebe would marry him and the debt would be wiped clean. Refusal was not an option he presented. The memory of his cold, demanding eyes made Phoebe shiver even in the warm afternoon air. Today was the day he expected their final answer at the town gathering. The town gathering was a weekly event, a time for the small community to come together to share news and to trade goods. It was normally a cheerful, bustling affair, filled with the laughter of children and the friendly bartering of neighbors. But on this day attention hung over the town square. People spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting towards Phoebe and her family as they arrived. They all knew of Jasper's ultimatum, and a shared feeling of powerlessness settled over them. No one had the means to challenge Jasper, and no one was foolish enough to try. Phoebe stood near her parents, her simple dress feeling like a shroud. She tried to pray, to find a sliver of the faith that had always guided her, but the words felt stuck in her throat, drowned out by the pounding of her own fearful heart. Then he arrived. Jasper rode into the center of the square on a large, restless horse, its coat as dark and slick as oil. He dismounted with a heavy thud, his gaze sweeping over the crowd until it landed squarely on Phoebe. A smile that held no warmth stretched across his face. He did not bother with greetings or pleasantries. He walked directly to where she stood, his presence causing the people nearby to instinctively step back. "Well now," his voice boomed too loud for the quiet square. "I believe we have an agreement to settle. The time for waiting is over." He looked at Phoebe's father, whose shoulders slumped in defeat. "Your debt is called due. But I am a generous man. Give me your daughter's hand and we will consider the matter closed." Phoebe felt the eyes of the entire town upon her. She felt the weight of her family's shame and fear. She wanted to run, to scream, to disappear into the vast landscape that surrounded them. But she was rooted to the spot, a prisoner of her family's misfortune. Jasper took her silence as agreement. He reached out a thick, calloused hand to take her arm. "Come along then," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was in that moment, as his fingers were about to close around her wrist, that a new voice cut through the heavy air. It was a calm voice, but it carried a strength that made everyone turn. "That's far enough." Standing at the edge of the crowd was a man named Ezra. He was a cowboy who kept to himself, working the line for a ranch on the far side of the valley. He was not a man who sought attention, but there was a quiet steadiness about him that people respected. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, not aimed at anyone, but its presence was a clear statement. All talking had ceased. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind. Ezra's eyes, a clear and serious brown, were fixed on Jasper. He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate, until he stood between Jasper and Phoebe. Jasper's face flushed with anger. "This is none of your concern, cowboy. This is a private business matter." "The heart of a woman is never just business," Ezra replied, his voice still even. He then turned to Phoebe's parents, his expression softening from its hard edge into one of profound compassion. "I have heard of your trouble. I do not have much, but what I have is earned by honest work." He looked directly at Jasper. I will pay this family's debt. Every last cent of it. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jasper stared in disbelief, then let out a short, harsh laugh. You think you can scrape together that kind of money? I can and I will, Ezra said, his gaze never wavering. He then turned his attention to Phoebe. For the first time, he truly looked at her, seeing not just a woman in distress, but the kindness in her eyes and the strength it took to stand there with such dignity. His voice was gentle when he spoke again, meant for her and her family. But my offer comes with a condition of its own. He paused, letting his words settle. I will pay the debt so that Phoebe's choice can be her own. And then, with your permission and hers, I would ask for the chance to court her properly. To sit on your porch and come to know her. To see if, in time and with God's grace, something real might grow between us. No force. No fear. Just the slow and honest work of building trust. The silence that followed was profound. Phoebe's mother, Lydia, began to cry, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief and hope. Her father looked at Ezra, seeing not a stranger, but a lifeline thrown to him in his darkest hour. He slowly nodded his head, unable to find the words. All eyes then turned to Phoebe. The fear that had frozen her had melted away, replaced by a torrent of emotions, gratitude, curiosity, and a fragile, blossoming hope. She looked at this brave, quiet man who had stepped out of the shadows to defend her, not with violence, but with a shocking and principled kindness. She gave a single, graceful nod of her head, her eyes meeting his for a brief, powerful moment. In that look, a promise was silently made, and a new, uncertain, but hopeful future began. The days that followed the dramatic standoff in the town square were filled with a new and unfamiliar tension, a quiet anticipation that hung over the valley like the gentle haze of a morning dew. For Phoebe, the crushing weight of despair had been lifted, but in its place was a fluttery nervousness, a constant wondering about the quiet cowboy and the future he had proposed. Her family's small homestead, which for weeks had felt like a prison, was now filled with a fragile sense of relief. Her mother, Lydia, began to hum again as she worked, the sound a sweet melody that had been absent for too long. Her father, while still burdened by shame over the situation his failures had caused, walked with a straighter back, his hands busy with the honest work of repairing fences and tending to livestock, no longer paralyzed by the specter of debt. Ezra was a man of his word. The very next day he rode into town and went directly to the small, imposing building that housed Jasper's financial interests. He did not boast or gloat. He simply laid a leather pouch heavy with gold coins on the desk, followed by a carefully written bank draft for the remaining sum, the result of years of frugal living and hard saving. Jasper was there, his face a thundercloud of fury and resentment. He counted the money with rough, angry movements, but he could find no fault. The debt was paid in full. He snatched the promissory note from his ledger and thrust it at Ezra, his voice a low growl. Take it, and take your chances with that girl. You've bought my debt, but you can't buy her heart. Ezra met his gaze steadily, taking the crumpled paper. A heart isn't something to be bought, he replied calmly. It's something to be earned. A truth he never understood. He left the building, the cancelled note safely in his pocket, and the first part of his promise was complete. His next task was to deliver this proof to Phoebe's family. He rode out to their homestead that evening, as the long shadows of the cottonwood trees stretched across the land. He did not ride right up to the house, a gesture of respect for their privacy and the unusual nature of the situation. Instead, he dismounted at the gate and walked the final distance, leading his horse. He found Phoebe and her mother sitting on the porch, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. Phoebe's heart gave a little jump at the sight of him, and she smoothed her apron nervously. Ezra removed his hat, holding it in his hands. He greeted Lydia with a respectful nod and then turned his gaze to Phoebe, a softness in his eyes that eased her anxiety. Good evening, he said, his voice quiet and steady. I've come to return this to you. He held out the cancelled promissory note. Lydia took it with trembling hands, her eyes filling with fresh tears as she saw the large "paid" stamped across it. She reached out and squeezed Ezra's arm. Thank you, son. You have given us our lives back. Ezra nodded. The debt is settled. The past is behind you now. He then looked at Phoebe, and his next words were carefully chosen. And now, if it is still agreeable, I would like to begin the second part of our agreement. I was hoping, with your mother's presence, that I might sit a while and we could talk. And so began the careful, deliberate dance of their courtship. True to his word and the strictures of their faith, Ezra never once overstepped. His visits were always announced, always conducted in the open air of the porch or in the main room of the house with Lydia or her father present. He never tried to touch Phoebe, beyond perhaps the brief, polite taking of her hand to help her down the porch steps on a walk. Their conversation started simply, like two streams slowly merging. He asked her about her life, her interests, the small details that made her who she was. He learned that she loved the smell of rain on dry earth, that she had a gift for growing herbs in the small patch of garden behind the house, and that her favorite psalms were those that spoke of God's protection and faithfulness. In turn, Phoebe began to learn about the man who had saved her. He spoke not of his own bravery but of his life on the range. He told her stories of watching a new calf take its first wobbly steps, of the profound silence of a snow-covered landscape, and of the simple satisfaction of a long day's work done well. He spoke of his faith, which was not a loud or showy thing, but a deep, unshakable foundation, like the bedrock of the mountains. He believed God had a plan for every life, and he saw the hand of providence in the way their paths had crossed. He listened to her with a focused intensity that made her feel that her every word was valuable. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his words had weight and meaning. Weeks turned into a month, and the autumn leaves began to blaze with color. Ezra's presence became a welcome and expected part of their lives. He didn't just come to court Phoebe, he came to help the family. He noticed a hinge on the barn door was loose and returned the next day with his tools to fix it. He spent a full Saturday helping Phoebe's father mend a long section of fence that had been neglected, working side by side in silent, companionable labor. He brought small, thoughtful gifts, not expensive trinkets, but a book of poetry he thought Phoebe might enjoy, a particularly smooth and interesting piece of river stone for her windowsill, a bundle of wildflowers picked from a meadow he had passed through. Each action, each word, was a brick being laid in the foundation of their future. Phoebe watched him, her initial gratitude slowly and surely transforming into a deep and abiding affection. She saw the respect he showed her parents, the kindness in his eyes when he spoke to children in town, the gentle way he handled his horse. She saw a man who was strong enough to be kind, principled enough to be patient, and faithful enough to trust in God's timing. The fear that had once gripped her heart was a distant memory, replaced by a warm and growing certainty. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ezra turned to her. Her mother was inside, giving them the illusion of privacy while still being close by. "Phoebe," he began, his voice a little more serious than usual, "these weeks of knowing you have been the richest of my life. I paid a debt of money to free you from a bad man, but in coming to know you, I feel it is I who have been given a priceless gift." He paused, gathering his words. "My feelings for you have grown from a desire to protect into a deep and lasting love. I cannot imagine my future without you in it." He reached into his pocket and brought out a simple, beautiful ring, a single small pearl set in a band of polished silver. "I love you, Phoebe. Would you do me the greatest honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of pure joy welled in Phoebe's eyes. There was no hesitation in her heart. The journey that had begun with such terror had led her to this moment of perfect peace and certainty. "Yes, Ezra," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." A smile, rare and brilliant, broke across Ezra's face as he carefully slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Lydia, who had been watching from the window, came out onto the porch, her own eyes shining, and embraced them both. The courtship was over. The promise of a life together, built on a foundation of respect, faith, and slowly blossomed love, was now sealed. The news of the engagement spread through the small community not as a shock, but as a long-awaited and joyful confirmation. The story of Ezra's brave stand and his honorable courtship had become a cherished tale, a modern-day parable of good triumphing over greed and love being built on a foundation of respect. In the weeks that followed Ezra's proposal, a quiet but purposeful energy settled over both the homestead and Ezra's small, well-kept ranch. There was a shared sense of building towards something beautiful and holy, a collective project that involved the entire town in some small way. Phoebe's simple pearl ring was not just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of a promise kept and a new promise begun, and she found herself looking at it countless times a day, a soft smile always touching her lips. The preparations for the wedding were a community affair, filled with the kind of warmth and generosity that defined their way of life. Lydia and the other women of the town took charge of Phoebe's wedding dress. It was not made of expensive silk or lace, but of the finest, softest white muslin they could procure. They gathered in Lydia's parlor, their needles flashing in the lamplight as they sewed delicate stitches, their conversations a gentle hum of shared wisdom and happy anticipation. They embroidered a tiny, almost secret pattern of wildflowers around the collar and cuffs, each stitch a whispered prayer for the bride. Phoebe, who had always been skilled with herbs, carefully dried lavender and rosemary, weaving small sprigs into her bridal bouquet. Their fragrance sent a promise of devotion and remembrance. Meanwhile, Ezra, with the help of Phoebe's father and several other men from the church, worked on the small ranch house he had built with his own hands years before, always hoping for this very future. They gave it a fresh coat of whitewash until it gleamed in the sunlight. They repaired the porch steps and planted a young sapling near the front door, a living symbol of the new life that would grow there. Inside, Ezra built a new, sturdy table large enough for a family, and a rocking chair that he placed near the fireplace, imagining Phoebe sitting there in the evenings. He did not see these tasks as chores, but as acts of love. Each nail hammered and each board sanded, a physical expression of his commitment to providing a safe and warm home for his wife. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, a crispness in the autumn air that made everything seem sharp and new. The small white church at the end of the main street was filled to overflowing with friends, neighbors and well-wishers. Sunlight streamed through the plain glass windows, illuminating the bunches of late-blooming goldenrod and purple asters that decorated the ends of the pews. A hushed, reverent anticipation filled the room. When Ezra, dressed in his best dark trousers and a clean white shirt, took his place at the front next to Pastor Lewis, there was a collective intake of breath. He stood tall and solemn, his usual quiet reserve replaced by a palpable, profound emotion that shone in his eyes. This was the most important day of his life. Then the simple wooden doors at the back of the church opened. Phoebe stood there on her father's arm, a vision of radiant grace. The muslin dress seemed to glow in the sunlight, and the gentle embroidery at her neck and wrists was a perfect testament to her quiet, natural beauty. Her face was partly veiled by a simple lace mantilla that had belonged to her grandmother, but through it, everyone could see the serene and joyful smile on her face. As she began her slow walk down the aisle, her eyes met Ezra's, and in that look, all the uncertainty of the past, all the fear and the hope, melted away into a perfect, unshakable certainty. Her father, his own eyes glistening with tears of redemption, placed her hand into Ezra's steady, waiting one. Pastor Lewis's voice was warm and strong as he addressed the congregation and the couple before him. He spoke not of easy happiness but of sacred commitment. "We are gathered here today not merely to witness a joining of two lives," he began, "but to bear witness to the power of faith and the triumph of righteousness. This union was born not from convenience but from courage. It was nurtured not by passion alone, but by patience and principle." He spoke of the covenant of marriage, a threefold cord between a man, a woman, and God, a bond that could not be easily broken. He talked about the roles of husband and wife, of a love that protects and provides and a love that respects and nurtures. He reminded them that their home was to be a sanctuary, a small piece of God's kingdom on earth, built on the rock of their shared faith. His words were not just for Ezra and Phoebe, but for every person in the room, a reaffirmation of their own vows and beliefs. When it came time for their vows, Ezra's voice, though low, was clear and carried to every corner of the silent church. "I, Ezra, take you, Phoebe, to be my wife. Before God and these witnesses, I promise to be your loving and faithful husband. I will care for you, provide for you, and protect you in times of plenty and in times of want, in joy and in sorrow, all the days of my life, so long as God gives us breath." His eyes never left hers, and the depth of his commitment was as solid and real as the earth beneath their feet. Then it was Phoebe's turn. Her voice was soft but steady, filled with a love that had been tested and found true. "I, Phoebe, take you, Ezra, to be my husband. Before God and these witnesses, I promise to be your loving and faithful wife. I will honor you, support you, and walk beside you in times of plenty and in times of want, in joy and in sorrow, all the days of my life, so long as God gives us breath." As she spoke the final word, a single tear of pure happiness escaped and traced a path down her cheek. Pastor Lewis smiled. "By the authority vested in me by God and this community, I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder." A collective sigh of joy seemed to sweep through the church. Ezra gently lifted Phoebe's veil. He looked at her for a long moment, his heart in his eyes, before leaning down to press a single tender and respectful kiss upon her lips, sealing their sacred covenant. The celebration that followed was simple but filled with profound happiness. Tables were set up in the churchyard, laden with food brought by every family, roasted meats, fresh bread, pies of every kind. There was music from a fiddle and a guitar, and the sound of laughter and dancing filled the crisp autumn air. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues. It was time for the couple to depart. They said their grateful goodbyes, their hearts full from the love of their community. Ezra helped Phoebe into a simple wagon that had been decorated with ribbons and flowers by the town's children. As he climbed up beside her and took the reins, the crowd cheered and waved, sending them off with their blessings. They rode in a comfortable, happy silence towards the ranch, the stars beginning to pepper the vast, darkening sky. When they arrived, Ezra carried his bride over the threshold of the home he had prepared for her. He set her down gently in the main room, where a fire crackled warmly in the hearth. They stood for a moment, hand in hand, looking around at the simple, clean space that was now their home. It was a house built on promise, and now it was filled with the fulfillment of that promise. Their life together as husband and wife had officially begun, under the watchful eyes of God and the quiet blanket of a starlit night, a perfect beginning to their blessed union. The first year of Ezra and Phoebe's marriage was a quiet symphony of shared labor and deepening love, a gradual intertwining of two lives into one seamless whole. Their home, once a silent structure built on hope, now breathed with the rhythms of a partnership. The crisp morning air would often find them working side by side, Ezra tending to the livestock in the corral while Phoebe cared for the small kitchen garden she had planted, its rows neat and promising. Evenings were spent in the soft glow of the kerosene lamp, Ezra sometimes reading aloud from the Bible while Phoebe mended clothes or worked on a new quilt, the steady rhythm of her needle a comforting sound. They learned the subtle language of marriage, a shared glance that communicated a whole thought, a gentle touch in passing that spoke of unwavering support, a quiet prayer of thanks before a simple meal that acknowledged the grace that had brought them together. The turning of the seasons marked their shared journey. They weathered the deep, silent snows of winter, the house a warm and sturdy refuge against the blowing winds. They rejoiced together in the frantic muddy thaw of spring, watching as new green shoots pushed through the earth on the range and in their own small plot of land. It was during this time of renewal, as the world burst forth with life, that Phoebe first began to notice a change within herself. A certain tiredness clung to her in the mornings, and the familiar scent of coffee brewing, which she usually loved, suddenly seemed sharp and unpleasant. She said nothing at first, attributing it to the change in the weather or the busyness of their life. But as the weeks passed and the signs became more pronounced, a slow, wondrous suspicion began to dawn in her heart. One afternoon, while visiting her mother, Lydia took one long look at her daughter's pale but radiant face and the way her hand unconsciously rested on her stomach, and a knowing smile touched her lips. "Child," she said softly, taking Phoebe's hands in her own, "I believe the good Lord is blessing your home in a new and wonderful way." The confirmation came a week later during a visit from the town's doctor, a kind, elderly man who had brought both Ezra and Phoebe into the world. He examined Phoebe gently in the main room of the ranch house while Ezra waited outside on the porch, his hands clenched tightly together, a silent prayer on his lips. When the doctor emerged, his face was creased with a warm smile. "It's as you suspected, Ezra," he said, his voice filled with genuine happiness for the young couple. "You're going to be a father. Phoebe is strong and healthy. All is well." The joy that filled the small house was a tangible, overflowing thing. Ezra, a man of few words, found himself speechless, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears as he looked at his wife. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, and pressed his forehead against them. "A child," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "A gift from God himself." Phoebe placed a hand on his dark hair, her own heart so full it felt it might burst. Their love, which had been a private and cherished thing, was now blossoming into a miracle, a new life that would be a part of both of them. From that day forward, a new, tender layer was added to their relationship. Ezra's protective nature, always present, became even more gentle and pronounced. He insisted on taking on the heavier chores himself, his voice firm but loving whenever Phoebe tried to lift something he deemed too heavy. As Phoebe's body slowly changed, a visible testament to the life growing within her, the entire community seemed to share in their quiet joy. Lydia visited often, her arms always full, a basket of fresh eggs, a jar of preserves, but most importantly, her experience and calming presence. She and Phoebe spent hours together, not in the main room, but in the space that would become the nursery, a small, sunlit room adjacent to their own. Together they sorted through soft, worn flannel sheets that Lydia had saved, and began the joyful work of sewing tiny gowns and blankets. Lydia's hands, skilled and sure, showed Phoebe how to stitch a seam that would be soft against a baby's delicate skin. These were not just lessons in sewing, they were a passing down of wisdom, a silent conversation between generations of women about the sacred journey of motherhood. Ezra too prepared in his own way. In the evenings after the day's work was done, he would retreat to his workshop in the barn. There, by the light of a single lantern, he began to build a cradle. He chose the wood with great care, smooth, sturdy oak for the frame. He sanded every piece for hours until it was as soft as silk, ensuring there was not a single splinter that could harm a tiny hand. He carved no elaborate designs, but the work was flawless, the joints tight and strong, a piece of furniture built not just with skill, but with a father's love and anticipation. The rhythmic sound of his planing and sanding became a nightly melody, a companion to the crackling fire in the hearth and the contented sigh of the wind outside. The final weeks of Phoebe's pregnancy seemed to stretch, each day a slow, patient waiting. The wide, open landscape of the ranch, usually a place of constant activity, took on a hushed, expectant quality. Then one night, long after the moon had risen, the waiting ended. The pains began, sharp and regular, and Ezra, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement, rode swiftly to fetch the doctor and Lydia. The ride back to the ranch felt like the longest of his life, every second an eternity. When they arrived, Lydia took charge with a calm efficiency, sending Ezra to wait in the main room while she and the doctor attended to Phoebe. The door to the bedroom was closed, and for Ezra time seemed to stop. He paced the floor, his boots making a soft, worn path on the rug. He could hear Phoebe's muffled cries of effort from the other room, each one a knife to his heart. He dropped to his knees beside the rocking chair he had made for her, praying as he had never prayed before, pleading for strength for his wife and safety for their child. The night wore on, the stars tracing their slow arc across the black sky. Just as the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, a new sound pierced the silence. Not a cry of pain, but the strong, healthy, indignant wail of a newborn. The bedroom door opened, and Lydia stood there, her face tired but glowing with a profound joy. "Ezra," she said softly, "come and meet your son." He rose on unsteady legs and walked into the room. Phoebe lay in the bed, exhausted but radiant, her face bathed in a love so powerful it seemed to light the room. In her arms, swaddled tightly in one of the soft blankets they had sewn together, was a tiny, perfect baby, his face pink and his mouth a small, searching rosebud. Ezra approached slowly as if approaching something holy. He knelt by the bedside, his large, work-roughened hand trembling as he reached out to gently stroke the baby's downy cheek. "He's perfect," Ezra whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. He looked at Phoebe, his eyes saying everything his words could not. "You're so brave. My wonderful, brave wife." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, a tear finally escaping to trace a path through the dust of the night on his cheek. Phoebe smiled wearily, her own eyes full of tears of happiness. "His name is Micah," she said softly, a name they had chosen together, which meant, "who is like God?" A testament to the miracle they held in their arms. As the new sun broke over the horizon, filling the room with a golden light, the small family was wrapped in a peace that felt eternal. The long night of fear was over, and the new day had dawned, bringing with it the profound and awesome responsibility of a new life. Their love had created a family. The years, like a gentle and steady river, flowed onward from that dawn when Micah first drew breath. The small ranch, once a quiet testament to a single man's hope, now thrived with the vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy of a growing family. The sapling Ezra had planted by the porch the summer before his marriage had stretched into a strong, shade-giving tree, its branches a witness to the life unfolding beneath it. It was under this very tree that a little girl with her mother's sunny hair and her father's serious brown eyes now sat, carefully arranging a circle of pebbles. Her name was Abigail, and she was the living proof that God's blessings often multiply in ways beyond imagining. Inside the sturdy ranch house, the cradle Ezra had built with such patient love now stood empty in a corner, a cherished relic, for Micah had grown into a sturdy boy of nearly 5 years, who followed his father like a small, earnest shadow, his own tiny boots caked with the same rich earth. The rhythm of their days was a familiar and comforting song. Mornings began with Ezra's voice, low and steady, reading from the well-worn family Bible as they all sat around the table he had built. Phoebe, her gentle beauty softened and deepened by motherhood, would listen, her hand often resting on little Abigail's head, her heart full to overflowing. After prayers, the work of the day would begin. Ezra and his young son would head out to check on the livestock, the boy's small hand trustingly tucked inside his father's large, calloused one. Phoebe would teach Abigail the simple, sacred tasks of homekeeping, how to knead bread dough until it was smooth and elastic, how to churn butter, and the names of the herbs in the garden that could soothe a fever or flavor a stew. The house was filled with the smells of baking bread and drying herbs, the sounds of children's laughter, and the underlying peace of a shared faith. One bright Sunday morning, the family walked together to the little white church, a weekly tradition as unshakable as the mountains surrounding the valley. Ezra carried Abigail on his shoulders while Micah walked solemnly beside his mother, trying to match his steps to hers. The church was full, the air buzzing with the quiet greetings of neighbors and the rustling of Sunday best clothes. As they settled into their familiar pew, Pastor Lewis, his hair now more silver than gray, stepped up to the pulpit. His sermon that day was about legacy and God's faithfulness through the generations. He spoke of how choices made in faith, like a single seed planted in good soil, could grow into a mighty tree whose branches would offer shade and shelter for years to come. As he spoke, his kind eyes drifted to Ezra and Phoebe, and he gave them a small, knowing smile. The entire congregation understood the unspoken reference, and a warm, approving silence filled the room. Phoebe felt a blush of humble gratitude, and Ezra's hand found hers, giving it a gentle, affirming squeeze. After the service, as the community spilled out into the sunlight, the scene was one of happy chaos. Children ran and played tag between the gravestones, while their parents talked in small groups. It was then that Ezra and Phoebe saw him. Jasper stood alone near the edge of the churchyard, leaning against a post. The years had not been kind to him. His expensive clothes seemed to hang on a frame that had grown gaunt, and his face was etched with deep lines of bitterness and discontent. He watched the lively scene, his eyes particularly lingering on Ezra and Phoebe. He saw Ezra lift a laughing Abigail high into the air, her little dress fluttering like a flag. He saw Micah run up to Phoebe, proudly showing her a pretty stone he had found, and he saw the way she bent down, her face full of tender attention as she admired his treasure. He saw the way Ezra's hand rested protectively on the small of Phoebe's back, a simple gesture that spoke of a deep and abiding partnership. In that moment, standing in the lonely chill of his own making, Jasper understood the true cost of his choices. He had spent his life chasing money and control, believing them to be the sources of power. But as he watched this family, this man who had started with nothing but a rifle and a principle, and this woman he had fought for, he saw a different kind of wealth. He saw a wealth of love, of legacy, of peace. He saw the vibrant, healthy children and the respect of the entire community. He saw the unshakable bond between a husband and wife who had built their life on a foundation of faith and mutual respect. The grand house he lived in was empty and silent, while the simple ranch house echoed with laughter and prayer. A profound and painful realization dawned in his eyes, and without a word he turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, finally comprehending that he had lost the most valuable thing a person could ever have. The walk home for Ezra and Phoebe's family was filled with a different spirit. The children skipped ahead, Micah now telling his sister a grand, imaginative story about the stone in his pocket. The sun was warm on their faces and the path was well-trodden and familiar. Ezra reached for Phoebe's hand, their fingers interlacing as naturally as they had that first day they had walked together on her parents' porch. They did not speak of Jasper, there was no need. The lesson was clear, a living testimony to the moral they had built their lives upon. They walked in comfortable silence, their hearts communicating in the wordless language shared by two people who have weathered storms and now bask in the sunshine of God's faithfulness. They arrived home to the ranch that was their sanctuary, their small piece of heaven on earth. As Ezra lifted Abigail down from his shoulders and Micah ran off to check on his favorite chick, Ezra paused at the door, pulling Phoebe into a gentle embrace. He looked out over the land, the grazing cattle, the sturdy home, and the two healthy children, then he looked down at the woman in his arms, her love for him shining brightly in her eyes. "This," he said softly, his voice filled with a conviction that came from the depths of his soul. "This is what matters. This is forever." Phoebe smiled, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "Forever," she agreed. Their story was not one of dramatic adventure, but of quiet consistency. It was a story that proved that true love is built on protection and patience, that a family begins with a sacred promise before God, and that a life lived in faith, no matter how simple, leaves a legacy that echoes into eternity. They had faced the storm and found their shelter in each other and in their belief, and now they lived each day in the profound peace of their forever after, a love story written not in ink, but in the daily acts of devotion, a testament to the power of a promise kept. If you enjoyed this story of faith, love, and redemption, please subscribe for more tales that warm the heart and strengthen the spirit. Your support helps us share more stories like Ezra and Phoebe's. God bless.